Number 10. The giant ground sloth. Some prehistoric creatures are terrifying because they were obvious predators, but others are more unsettling because they seem to belong to a world where even the shape of harmless life could become enormous, strange, and difficult for the modern mind to accept. The giant ground sloth belongs to that second category of prehistoric unease. At first glance, it does not seem like the most frightening creature on this list. It was not built like a shark, a giant crocodile, or a saber-toothed cat. It was a mammal, a relative of modern sloths, and that connection almost tricks the imagination into expecting something slow, awkward, and harmless. But the deeper one looks, the stranger and heavier the animal becomes. Some species were immense, with powerful limbs, massive claws, and a body so large that it transformed the familiar image of a tree sloth into something ancient, hulking, and almost surreal. That is what gives the giant ground sloth such power in prehistoric imagination. It reminds us that the lost world was not populated only by elegant predators and famous reptiles. It was also filled with mammals that seem as though evolution had briefly stepped into a darker, more exaggerated register. The idea of a sloth expanded to such massive scale already feels unnatural to modern eyes, but the effect grows stronger when we imagine the animal standing upright, using its powerful body and claws to reach vegetation or defend itself. In that posture, it no longer feels like a curiosity. It begins to feel monumental. It becomes one of those extinct beings that challenges our sense of what a mammal is supposed to look like, not because it is demonic, but because it is real and yet visually close to impossible. What keeps the giant ground sloth haunting is not that it was a top predator, but that it carried size and strength into a form that should have remained gentle and familiar. That contradiction matters. Human beings are often more disturbed by creatures that distort known categories than by creatures that simply look monstrous from the beginning. A giant reptile feels ancient in an expected way. A giant sloth feels wrong in a more intimate way, because it stretches something recognizable beyond the point of comfort. Fossils and reconstructions only deepen that effect. The bones show unmistakable mass, the claws suggest formidable power, and the body hints at a world in which even plant-eating mammals could possess a physical presence so overwhelming that they seem almost mythical. In the end, the giant ground sloth survives in the imagination because it represents one of prehistory's darkest lessons. Extinction did not only erase predators that inspire fear, it erased entire forms of life so strange that their absence now protects us from having to see how bizarre the mammalian world once truly was. It was not a monster from legend. It was a real beast of the ancient Americas, huge enough to dominate its space and strange enough to make the modern world feel narrower by comparison. The more one studies it, the more it seems like proof that prehistory was not merely older than our world. In some ways, it was wilder than our minds still know how to picture. Number 9. The woolly rhino. Some extinct creatures feel haunting because they belong to a world too distant to imagine clearly, but others are more disturbing because they lived close enough to human beings that the gap between prehistory and memory begins to narrow. The woolly rhino carries exactly that kind of dark presence. This was not a dinosaur from some unimaginable abyss of time. It was an Ice Age giant, a massive horned mammal moving through frozen grasslands and bitter cold landscapes that early humans themselves once knew. That proximity gives the creature unusual force. It did not vanish in a world entirely separate from our own. It belonged to a harsh and brutal age that human beings had already entered, which makes it feel less like a symbol of remote prehistory and more like a reminder of what our ancestors once shared the earth with. That is what makes the woolly rhino so powerful in the imagination. Its body already carries the intimidation of the modern rhinoceros, an animal that even now feels prehistoric in its weight, aggression, and armor-like form. But the woolly version seems darker, heavier, and more apocalyptic, built for a frozen world of wind, snow, and survival. Covered in thick fur, armed with great horns, and adapted to Ice Age extremes, It appears less like an ordinary large herbivore and more like a moving force of nature. The cold environment around it intensifies everything. A rhinoceros in grassland feels dangerous. A rhinoceros in a glacial wasteland feels almost mythic, as though it belongs to a dying world of ice, hunger, and ancient violence. The woolly rhino also haunts the imagination because it shows how little comfort, size, and familiarity can offer in prehistory. People often divide extinct animals into simple categories, predators that kill and herbivores that seem passive by comparison, but the Ice Age refuses that comfort. A massive herbivore can still be terrifying. A horned beast weighing enormous amounts, living in extreme conditions, and capable of violent defense does not need to hunt in order to feel fearsome. In many ways, creatures like the woolly rhino make the ancient world seem even more hostile because they suggest ecosystems where danger was not limited to the act of predation. Power was everywhere. Even the plant eaters could look like siege weapons moving across the snow. What keeps the woolly rhino alive in human imagination is that it stands at the threshold between fossil deep time and human witness. We know enough about it to make it vivid, but not enough to make it ordinary. Cave art, preserved remains, and Ice Age reconstruction all help restore its shape, yet the result is not reassurance. It is unease. The animal feels too real to dismiss as fantasy and too alien to fit comfortably into the modern world. That is why it endures. It is one of those prehistoric beasts that reminds us extinction did not only erase strange creatures from some unreachable age, it erased powerful animals that once walked a world not so distant from our own, a world where cold, scale, and brute force shaped life into forms that still seem capable of trampling their way straight out of the past. Number 8. Dunkleosteus. Some prehistoric predators are frightening because they resemble monsters we already know, but others are more disturbing because they seem to come from a version of evolution that no longer feels connected to the modern world at all. Dunkleosteus belongs to that darker category of ancient life. This armored fish from the Devonian seas did not rely on rows of familiar shark teeth or the sleek anatomy of later marine hunters. Instead, it carried something stranger and, in some ways, more brutal. A heavily armored body and powerful bony jaw plates capable of delivering devastating force. It looked less like an animal designed for modern oceans and more like a weapon built by an ancient world still experimenting with how terrifying a predator could become. That is what makes Dunkleosteus so powerful in the imagination. It is not merely large or predatory. It is alien in structure. The head appears encased in armor, the mouth opens into sharp, bony shears rather than the ordinary teeth people expect, and the whole animal seems to combine the logic of a machine, a tank, and a carnivore into one form. In that sense, it reveals one of the most unsettling truths about prehistory. The ancient seas were not only home to oversized versions of familiar dangers, but to entire designs of life that now feel almost incompatible with the modern imagination. A shark terrifies because we know what it is. Dunkleosteus terrifies because it reminds us that the ocean once produced predators that make even sharks seem more understandable by comparison. The marine setting deepens that fear. The sea already carries a natural sense of concealment, depth, and helplessness, and when we place a creature like Dunkleosteus inside it, the effect becomes even darker. This was not a lightly built swimmer or a fragile relic of an unfinished age. It was a dominant predator moving through waters where armor, crushing bite force, and brute power mattered enough to shape an entire body around them. To imagine encountering such a creature is to imagine being confronted not simply by a hunter, but by an ancient expression of raw, predatory engineering, a being from a time when the oceans were ruled by forms of violence now largely erased from the world. What keeps Dunkleosteus haunting is that it looks like proof that nature once built predators with a severity the human mind still struggles to process. Fossils can restore its shape, science can estimate its power, and reconstructions can place it back into the sea, but none of that makes it feel safe or ordinary. If anything, the more clearly it is understood, the more it seems like a glimpse into a vanished stage of life where the rules were harsher, stranger, and more physically extreme. Dunkleosteus survives in human imagination because it does not just represent a big fish from the past. It represents a lost world of armored death beneath the water, a world so old and so severe that it still feels less like history than like a warning. Number 7. Deinosuchus. Some extinct predators terrify because they feel ancient in a distant, almost abstract way, but others are more disturbing because they resemble something still alive today, only scaled up into a form that makes the modern world feel suddenly inadequate. Deinosuchus carries exactly that kind of prehistoric dread. At its core, it was a giant crocodilian, and that familiarity is part of what makes it so frightening. Human beings already understand crocodiles as ambush predators, as creatures of patience, sudden violence, and brutal certainty once they strike. Deinosuchus takes that existing fear and expands it into something immense. It was not a dragon or some impossible fantasy beast. It was, in essence, a crocodilian large enough to make even modern apex predators seem vulnerable. That is what gives Deinosuchus such unusual power in the imagination. It does not frighten us by breaking the known order of nature. It frightens us by proving how much more severe that order once was. A crocodilian already carries a primal horror because it feels ancient, efficient, and emotionally unreadable. It waits, it lunges, and it kills with a calm brutality that seems older than mammalian life itself. When that same body plan is magnified to the scale of Deinosuchus, the result feels almost intolerable. The rivers, deltas, and coastal environments it inhabited cease to feel like ecosystems and begin to feel like traps built around a single dominant force. Water itself becomes hostile in a deeper way when one imagines a predator like that beneath the surface. The ambush logic of Deinosuchus is central to its haunting quality. Some prehistoric hunters inspire awe because they chase, overpower, and visibly dominate. But an enormous crocodilian inspires a different fear, one rooted in concealment and suddenness. It does not need to advertise its presence. It only needs a shoreline, a river crossing, a muddy bank, or a moment of weakness from any creature coming near the water. That is what makes its scale so disturbing. A giant theropod feels like something you see and flee. A massive crocodilian belongs to the older nightmare in which danger is hidden, silent, and already close by before it reveals itself. What keeps Deinosuchus alive in human imagination is that it compresses millions of years of evolutionary fear into a single recognizable form. It reminds us that the ancient world did not require fantasy to produce monsters. It only needed to take real predatory designs and push them to extremes beyond modern comfort. The more one looks at Deinosuchus, the more it seems like an answer to a question no one wanted asked. How terrifying can a crocodilian become if time and evolution are given enough room? The answer is a beast large enough to haunt the imagination long after extinction, because it feels less like a creature from a vanished world than like the darkest possible version of something the world still remembers. Number 6. Arthropleura. Some prehistoric creatures are frightening because they were apex predators, but others are more unsettling because they transform something already instinctively disliked into a scale the human mind can barely accept. Arthropleura belongs to that second and darker category of ancient fear. It was not a giant reptile, a saber-toothed hunter, or a monstrous fish from the deep. It was an enormous arthropod, a distant relative of millipedes and other many-legged invertebrates, and that alone is enough to make it linger in the imagination with unusual force. Modern people may tolerate large mammals, fear large reptiles, and admire large cats from a distance, but when an invertebrate becomes gigantic, the reaction is often different. It does not inspire only awe, it inspires revulsion. Arthropleura takes that instinct and stretches it into prehistoric scale. That is what makes the creature so powerful. Even knowing that it was probably not an active predator does little to soften the effect. A massive segmented body, countless legs moving in coordination, An armored surface and an elongated form creeping across the ancient landscape create a kind of fear that bypasses logic and moves straight into the oldest layers of human discomfort. Many prehistoric animals look dramatic in a familiar way, but Arthropleura feels wrong in a more intimate sense. It suggests a world where even the forest floor could produce something huge enough to make the ground itself feel hostile. The issue is not only danger, it is the visual shock of scale applied to a body plan that modern people already associate with infestation, hidden movement, and unease. The ancient environment only deepens that effect. Arthropleura moved through prehistoric forests rich with giant plants, dense humidity, and unfamiliar ecosystems, which means it belonged to a world that already feels more alien than comforting. When we picture it emerging from shadows or moving over the ground in such a place, the scene feels less like natural history and more like a memory from a nightmare. That reaction matters because prehistoric fear is not built only from tooth and claw. Sometimes it is built from form itself. A creature can haunt the imagination simply by existing in a shape that should never have reached such dimensions, and Arthropleura may be one of the purest examples of that truth in all prehistory. What keeps Arthropleura alive in human imagination is that it reveals how narrow our comfort really is. People often say they could handle the ancient world if they avoided the biggest predators. But that confidence fades quickly once the lost world begins producing giant invertebrates that do not even need to hunt in order to feel unbearable. Arthropleura survives in the mind because it reminds us that prehistory was not only violent, it was visually extreme. It allowed familiar forms to become immense in ways that still make the skin crawl. Even as a non-predatory giant, it remains one of the most disturbing lost beasts of all, because it proves that the ancient world did not need monsters from myth to feel alien. It had enough real ones already. Number 5. Smilodon. Some prehistoric predators haunt the imagination because they were enormous, but others do so because every part of their anatomy seems designed to become an icon of fear. Smilodon, the so-called saber-toothed cat, belongs to that second category of lost terror. It was not the largest predator to ever live, and it was not the strangest, but few extinct mammals have achieved such lasting power in the human mind. The reason is immediately visible. Its long, saber-like canine teeth give it a face that seems almost too dramatic to be real, as though evolution briefly created a predator according to the logic of nightmare rather than ordinary survival. The moment one sees a reconstruction of Smilodon, the imagination understands why it refused to be forgotten. That visual power matters because Smilodon also carries a more unsettling truth beneath the famous teeth. This was not a fantasy beast. It was a real Ice Age predator moving through a world that early humans and other large mammals actually knew. It hunted in ecosystems crowded with giant herbivores, harsh competition, and constant physical struggle, and it did so with a body built for strength, grappling, and lethal force. The muscular limbs, the heavy frame, and the specialized skull all suggest an animal that was not merely swift or elegant, but overwhelmingly physical. Smilodon did not need to chase like a wolf in order to dominate the imagination. It only needed to close the distance once. After that, everything about its body seems to imply control, weight, and catastrophic injury. What keeps Smilodon haunting is the way it merges mammalian familiarity with something excessive and almost theatrical. A crocodilian or giant reptile can feel alien in an expected prehistoric way, but a great cat belongs to a category the human mind knows well. People already recognize the predator grace of lions, tigers, and other big cats. Smilodon darkens that familiar form. It turns the cat into something thicker, heavier, and more brutal, then crowns it with teeth so extreme that the face itself becomes a weapon. That transformation makes the animal especially memorable because it does not feel like a distant evolutionary experiment. It feels like a known fear sharpened past the point of comfort. In the end, Smilodon survives in human imagination because it embodies one of prehistory's most disturbing lessons. The ancient world could take even elegant mammalian predators and push them into forms that seem almost symbolically violent. Fossils can explain the animal, and science can debate its hunting behavior, but explanation does not weaken its image. If anything, it strengthens it. The more real Smilodon becomes, the more unsettling it feels. It was not a beast invented to terrify. It was a predator shaped by the Ice Age into one of the most unforgettable killing forms the mammalian world has ever produced. And that is why it still seems to stare out of prehistory like something that never fully accepted extinction. Number 4, Mosasaurus. Some prehistoric predators feel terrifying because they resemble forms we still fear today, but others are more disturbing because they seem to represent an entire world lost beneath the surface. Mosasaurus belongs to that darker kind of ancient power. It was a marine reptile of immense size, a dominant hunter of prehistoric seas, and one of the clearest reminders that the oceans once belonged to creatures far more overwhelming than most modern people are prepared to imagine. Sharks already command fear because they move through hidden depth with speed and precision, but Mosasaurus expands that fear into something heavier, more ancient, and in some ways more absolute. It was not simply a fish with teeth. It was a great reptilian predator, ruling an environment where human beings could never have survived long enough to understand the danger. That is what gives Mosasaurus such force in the imagination. The ocean is already one of the most psychologically hostile settings on Earth because it conceals scale, distance, and motion so completely. When we place a creature like Mosasaurus inside that setting, the result feels less like natural history and more like the recovery of a nightmare the world was lucky to lose. Its massive jaws, powerful body, and role as a top marine hunter transform the sea into something far more brutal than the modern mind likes to admit. To imagine such a creature rising through ancient waters is to imagine a world in which the horizon concealed not just storms and depth, but enormous reptilian violence moving below the surface with total belonging. What keeps Mosasaurus haunting is that it makes the prehistoric ocean feel actively predatory in a way that goes beyond ordinary marine fear. This was not a strange peripheral animal hiding in shadows. It was one of the rulers of its environment, a creature large enough and powerful enough to dominate the food chain and turn ancient seas into territories of constant danger. That matters because some extinct animals impress us mainly through their anatomy, while others disturb us through ecological role. Mosasaurus does both. It looks formidable, and it also occupied the exact position in its world that makes a predator feel most absolute. It did not merely survive in the sea, it commanded it. In the end, Mosasaurus survives in human imagination because it embodies one of the darkest truths about prehistory. The ancient oceans were not just deeper in mystery than ours. They were deeper in menace. Fossils can restore bones, science can refine scale, and reconstructions can return motion to the body, but none of that makes the creature smaller in the mind. If anything, the more real Mosasaurus becomes, the more unsettling the ancient sea feels. It remains one of the great lost rulers of water, a predator so immense and so perfectly made for marine violence that even now it seems less like a dead animal than like a reminder that Earth once tolerated powers far more severe than the modern world still knows how to imagine. Number 3. Terror birds. Some prehistoric predators haunt the imagination because they were reptiles, sharks, or giant mammals, but others disturb us more deeply because they twist something modern people think they understand into a form of nightmare. Terror birds belong to that second and more unsettling category. Birds in the modern world can be graceful, intelligent, predatory, or eerie, but they rarely dominate human fear in the same primal way as large cats, crocodiles, or sharks. Terror birds change that instantly. These enormous flightless avian predators transformed the familiar outline of a bird into something tall, fast, sharp, and brutally terrestrial, with hooked beaks, powerful legs, and a presence that made open land feel like hostile ground. That contrast is what gives them such lasting power. A bird should not feel like an apex predator large enough to own the landscape, yet in prehistory, some of them did. That is what makes terror birds so memorable. They do not frighten by pure size alone, they frighten by category violation. Human beings are accustomed to placing birds above the world, in the air, or at least at a manageable scale. But terror birds drag the avian form back down to the earth and enlarge it into something relentless. Their height, speed, and weaponized beaks create a very particular kind of prehistoric dread, one rooted not in reptilian coldness or mammalian stealth, but in the idea of a land predator that seems both familiar and profoundly wrong. To imagine one running across an ancient plain is to imagine the elegance of a bird fused with the direct menace of a hunter built to kill without ever needing teeth in the mammalian sense. The environment around them intensifies that fear. On open ground, there is nowhere for the mind to hide the way it might in forests or deep water. A predator adapted to pursuit in such landscapes becomes frightening in a cleaner, harsher way. Terror birds would not need the concealment of an ambush crocodilian or the invisibility of a marine hunter. Their presence alone would dominate the scene. The hooked beak becomes the central image, not because it is merely sharp, but because it seems to replace all softness or distance normally associated with birds. The creature becomes a walking answer to an ancient question. What happens when evolution turns the avian body plan toward dominance on land rather than escape into the sky? What keeps terror birds alive in human imagination is that they reveal how thin our sense of the natural order really is. The modern world teaches us that large land predators belong to certain familiar categories: cats, canids, reptiles, perhaps bears, but prehistory refuses that neatness. It creates a world in which even birds could become towering hunters capable of inspiring the same dread as any mammalian killer. Terror birds survive in the mind because they make the past feel unpredictable in a uniquely disturbing way. They show that extinction did not only erase giant beasts, it erased entire forms of fear that no longer walk beside us, and among the strangest of all was the fear of a bird too large to fly, too fast to ignore, and too perfectly shaped to let the open land feel safe. Number 2. Titanoboa. Some prehistoric creatures disturb the imagination because they were violent in familiar ways, but others do so because they take one of humanity's oldest instinctive fears and expand it into something almost impossible to process. Titanoboa belongs to that darker category of lost terror. Snakes already occupy a unique place in human psychology. Even when they are small, silent, and unseen, they can provoke immediate fear because they represent stealth, suddenness, and a kind of movement that feels ancient and unreadable. Titanoboa takes that fear and stretches it to colossal scale. It was not simply a large snake. It was a serpent so immense that the modern mind struggles to hold its proportions without sliding from science into nightmare. That is what gives Titanoboa such enduring force. Unlike some prehistoric beasts that require explanation to become frightening, Titanoboa is terrifying almost immediately. The image alone is enough. A massive constrictor moving through humid prehistoric swamps, its body thick as a nightmare-made flesh, transforms the environment around it into something unlivable. Waterways become ambush zones, mud and vegetation become cover for a length of living muscle too large to accept calmly. The fear here is not theatrical, it is primal. Human beings do not need to be experts in paleontology to understand why a giant serpent is disturbing. The mind grasps it at once because it magnifies an already ancient threat into a form that feels almost biblically severe. The swamp setting intensifies everything. Dense heat, dark water, reeds, mud, and concealed movement already create one of the most psychologically hostile environments in nature. To place Titanoboa there is to imagine a world where even the stillness is predatory. Some extinct hunters frighten us by chase, by teeth, or by visible dominance. Titanoboa frightens us through pressure and concealment. It does not need to roar. It does not need to display. Its body is enough. The idea that something so large could move almost silently through a drowned landscape creates a very specific prehistoric dread, one rooted in the fear that by the time you recognize the danger, you are already inside its reach. What keeps Titanoboa alive in human imagination is that it seems to represent one of the clearest ways the ancient world exceeded modern comfort. Snakes still exist and many are still dangerous. But Titanoboa reminds us that prehistory did not merely produce bigger versions of familiar animals. It produced extremes. It pushed known forms beyond the emotional limits of what people want the natural world to contain. The more scientists reconstruct Titanoboa, the less it feels like fantasy, and the more it feels like proof that Earth once tolerated a scale of serpentine life almost tailor-made to haunt the human mind. It survives because it is more than a giant reptile from the past. It is the old fear of the serpent restored to monstrous reality. Number 1. Megalodon. Some prehistoric predators are unforgettable because they were strange, some because they were gigantic, and some because they seemed to gather every fear of the ancient world into one perfectly devastating form. Megalodon stands at number 1 because no other lost beast so completely merges size, familiarity, and pure predatory terror. Sharks already hold a special power over the human imagination. They move beneath the surface unseen, they attack with speed and violence, and they belong to an environment where human beings are always at a disadvantage. Megalodon takes that existing fear and magnifies it to a scale that feels almost obscene. It was not some bizarre experimental creature that needs careful explanation before it becomes frightening. It was, in essence, a shark, and that simplicity is exactly what makes it so overwhelming. That is what gives Megalodon unmatched power in the imagination. A giant crocodilian is terrifying, a giant serpent is terrifying, and an armored fish from the Devonian seas is deeply unsettling, but a gigantic shark feels more immediate because it amplifies something the modern mind already knows how to fear. The ocean remains one of the few environments where people still feel instinctively vulnerable, and sharks are already among its clearest symbols of sudden death. Once that symbol is expanded into the immense scale associated with Megalodon, the sea itself begins to feel transformed. It is no longer just a vast space that may conceal danger. It becomes a realm that once held a predator so large that even whales could become prey. At that point, marine fear stops being local and becomes environmental. The whole ocean feels claimed by something enormous. Megalodon also endures because it sits at the perfect intersection of scientific reality and mythic exaggeration. Unlike purely legendary monsters, it truly existed. Teeth, fossil evidence, and ongoing public fascination keep returning it to visibility. But unlike many extinct animals that remain mostly confined to museums and documentaries, Megalodon has never stopped functioning as a cultural nightmare. It crosses easily into modern fears, survival fantasies, horror imagery, and the persistent fantasy that perhaps something so vast could still be hiding in the deep. Science rejects that idea, but the emotional structure of the fear survives because the ocean is still large enough to make people feel small, and Megalodon remains the ultimate expression of what that smallness means. What makes Megalodon worthy of the number 1 place is that it embodies the darkest lesson of all prehistoric life. The ancient world did not need supernatural monsters to terrify. It only needed to make real predators vastly larger than anything we are comfortable facing. Megalodon is not just a shark from the past. It is the purest symbol of prehistoric predatory scale, a creature that turns deep water into a sentence rather than a setting. Even in extinction, it continues to dominate the imagination because it feels like the final answer to a question human beings were never meant to ask. How large can a hunter become before the world itself begins to feel designed around its appetite? Megalodon survives because once you imagine it clearly, the ocean never quite returns to normal.